They laughed when she asked about the advanced tactical course. Said a small-town waitress couldn't hit water if she fell out of a boat. But when that Apache helicopter came screaming over the ridge, what happened next would rewrite every manual on precision shooting and prove that some legends hide in the most unexpected places. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Nevada sun had turned the Ironclad Tactical Range into a furnace by 7 in the morning, sending heat waves rippling across the high desert landscape like liquid glass. The facility sprawled across 200 acres of scrub brush and red rock, a playground for serious shooters who measured their skills in fractions of inches at distances that would make most people squint just to see the target. This wasn't the kind of place where weekend warriors came to plink at paper targets. This was where federal agents honed their craft, where military contractors tested new equipment, and where elite law enforcement units pushed the boundaries of what was possible with a rifle and a steady hand. The main building sat like a concrete fortress against the desert backdrop, its walls thick enough to muffle the constant crack of gunfire that echoed across the range from dawn to dusk. Inside, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the heat, creating a cool sanctuary where shooters could study ballistics charts, clean their weapons, and engage in the kind of technical discussions that sounded like a foreign language to outsiders. Velocity calculations, wind drift compensation, and minute of angle measurements flowed as naturally as casual conversation about the weather. The culture here was built on respect earned through demonstrated skill. Your military service record, your law enforcement credentials, your competition trophies, none of it mattered until you proved yourself on the firing line. The regulars had seen too many hotshots with impressive resumes, who couldn't group their shots tighter than a dinner plate at 100 yards. They'd watched federal agents with decades of experience struggle with wind conditions that local hunters navigated instinctively. In this place, your rifle spoke louder than your rank, and accuracy was the only currency that held any value. Morrison and Chen, the rangemaster, had built Ironclad from nothing 20 years ago. After retiring from the Marine Corps, he'd seen every type of shooter imaginable walk through those doors. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, FBI snipers, competitive shooters with endorsement deals, and weekend warriors with more money than sense. He could usually size up a shooter's capabilities within the first 5 minutes of watching them handle a weapon. The way they carried themselves, how they approached the firing line, the small technical details that separated the professionals from the pretenders. It all told a story to someone who knew how to read the signs. That's why he noticed her immediately. When she walked through the front entrance just after 8 o'clock, she moved differently than most people who entered his domain. Not with the swagger of someone trying to prove something. Not with the nervous energy of a novice stepping into unfamiliar territory, but with a kind of quiet purposefulness that suggested she knew exactly where she belonged and why she was there. She was average height, maybe 5'6", with brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing clothes that could have come from any department. Store clearance rack faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and worn hiking boots that had clearly seen real use. Everything about her appearance screamed ordinary. She carried herself like someone who'd spent years trying not to draw attention. Someone who'd learned that blending into the background was often the safest and most effective strategy. But there were small details that didn't quite fit the image of a casual visitor. Her posture was too good, too naturally straight without appearing forced or military stiff. Her eyes moved constantly but subtly, taking in the layout of the building, noting exits and sight lines with the unconscious awareness of someone whose survival had once depended on such observations. And her hands, they were steady in a way that suggested they'd held weapons, under circumstances where steadiness meant the difference between success and catastrophe. The morning crowd was already gathering around the coffee station, a mix of federal contractors, local law enforcement, and serious competitive shooters who treated the range like their second home. They spoke in the abbreviated language of professionals, discussing their equipment with the kind of technical precision that revealed years of dedicated practice. Barrel lengths, ammunition specifications, scope adjustments, and weather considerations flowed through their conversations like a specialized dialect that outsiders couldn't hope to understand. Sarah Martinez approached the front desk where Chen was reviewing the day's reservations. She moved with the same quiet confidence she'd displayed walking in, neither rushing nor hesitating, simply moving forward with the certainty of someone who'd made a decision and intended to see it through. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and direct without being aggressive or demanding. "I'd like to sign up for range time," she said, her tone suggesting she was placing an order at a restaurant rather than requesting access to a facility that catered to some of the most skilled marksmen in the country. "I was hoping to try the 1,000-yard course." Chen looked up from his clipboard, his experienced eyes automatically cataloging details. No visible gun case, no equipment bag, no sponsor patches or team logos on her clothing. She looked like someone who'd wandered in off the street, possibly confused about what kind of establishment this was. The 1,000-yard course wasn't something casual shooters attempted. It required not just exceptional skill, but also understanding of advanced ballistics, weather reading, and equipment capabilities that took years to develop. "Have you shot long range before?" he asked, his tone neutral but carrying the kind of professional assessment that came from dealing with overconfident newcomers on a regular basis. The 1,000-yard course requires demonstrated proficiency at shorter distances first. "I understand," Sarah replied, her response containing neither defensiveness nor false bravado. "I'm willing to start wherever you think is appropriate." Something in her tone made Chen pause. There was a quality to her voice that suggested she was accustomed to being underestimated, that she'd navigated similar conversations before, and learned that patience was more effective than argument. She wasn't trying to convince him of anything or prove her qualifications through words. She was simply stating her interest and accepting whatever process he deemed necessary. The conversation had drawn the attention of some nearby shooters, including Jake Morrison, a former FBI sniper who'd been coming to Ironclad for 5 years. Morrison had the kind of resume that impressed people at cocktail parties, federal service, multiple certifications, several competitive victories at regional events. He also had the kind of ego that made him feel entitled to comment on situations that weren't really his business. 1,000 yards? Morrison said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure he'd be heard by the small crowd gathering around the coffee station. "That's some serious distance shooting. Takes years to develop that kind of skill." His words were technically supportive, but his tone suggested he was speaking to a child who'd announced her intention to climb Mount Everest next weekend. The other shooters' attention was now focused on the exchange, their expressions ranging from amused to skeptical. They'd seen this scenario play out before, someone with unrealistic expectations learning hard lessons about the difference between confidence and competence. Sarah acknowledged Morrison's comment with a simple nod, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, just accepting that he'd chosen to insert himself into her conversation with the rangemaster. Her reaction, or lack thereof, seemed to reinforce his assumption that she didn't really understand what she was asking for. "Tell you what," Chen said, his tone taking on the patient quality of someone who'd had this conversation countless times before. "Why don't we start you on the 100-yard range, see how you do there, and work our way up? No point in jumping into the deep end before we know if you can swim." Sarah accepted the suggestion with the same quiet grace she'd shown throughout the exchange. She understood that every professional environment had its protocols, its hierarchies, and its ways of determining who belonged and who didn't. She'd learned long ago that fighting these systems was less effective than simply working within them until the opportunity arose to demonstrate what she was actually capable of achieving. What none of them knew, what nothing about her appearance or demeanor suggested, was that Sarah Martinez had once held a rifle steady for 17 hours in the mountains of Afghanistan, waiting for a target that would appear for less than 3 seconds in a window of opportunity measured in heartbeats. That she'd made shots in conditions that would have sent most of these confident professionals home shaking their heads in defeat. That hidden beneath her unremarkable exterior was a level of precision and experience that existed in the space between legend and classified reality. But for now, she was just another customer asking about range time, another person who'd probably struggled to hit a target the size of a dinner plate at 100 yards. At least, that's what everyone in the room believed as they went back to their conversations and equipment preparations, leaving Sarah to fill out the required paperwork and begin the slow process of proving that sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are the ones that seem most obviously true. Sarah completed the liability waiver and range safety documentation with the methodical precision of someone who'd filled out similar forms in places where the consequences of carelessness extended far beyond paperwork. Her handwriting was neat, economical, each letter formed with the kind of consistency that suggested muscle memory developed through years of writing reports under less than ideal conditions. When she reached the section asking for previous shooting experience, she paused for just a moment before writing military service in the small space provided. Chen glanced at the form when she handed it back, his eyes scanning the basic information without particular interest. Name, address, emergency contact, insurance verification, all standard details that told him nothing about her actual capabilities. The military service notation caught his attention for a fraction of a second, but plenty of people who'd served had never progressed beyond basic marksmanship. Administrative personnel, logistics specialists, and support staff all received the same fundamental training, but that didn't make them precision shooters. "What's your experience level?" he asked, settling into the routine questioning that helped him determine appropriate range assignments. "Basic rifle training, hunting, competition shooting?" "I'm comfortable with most rifle platforms," Sarah replied, her answer technically accurate while revealing nothing about the depth of her experience. "I'd prefer to rent something appropriate for long-range work if you have equipment available." Morrison, who'd been pretending to study a ballistics chart while obviously listening to their conversation, looked up with the expression of someone who'd just heard something mildly entertaining. The idea of renting a precision rifle for long range work struck him as fundamentally backwards. Serious shooters brought their own equipment, weapons they'd spent months or years fine-tuning for their specific needs and shooting style. Rental rifles were for tourists and beginners, not for anyone attempting legitimate precision work. "Our rental selection is pretty limited," Chen explained, his tone suggesting he was trying to manage expectations gently. "Most long-range shooters prefer their own equipment since every rifle shoots differently. Might be better to start with something basic and see how it goes." Behind the counter, Chen's assistant, a young woman named Kelly who'd worked at the range for 2 years, was organizing ammunition inventory with the kind of bored efficiency that came from performing the same tasks repeatedly. She'd seen hundreds of new shooters come through, most of them men who talked extensively about their plans and capabilities before demonstrating their actual skill level on the firing line. The quiet woman at the counter fit a pattern. Kelly recognized someone who'd probably watched too many movies and thought precision shooting looked easier than it actually was. "We've got a decent .308 in the rental inventory," Kelly offered, pulling out a well-maintained but unremarkable bolt-action rifle that served as their standard intermediate range option. "Good for learning fundamentals, reliable enough for anything. Out to about 600 yards in the right hands." Sarah examined the weapon with the quick, efficient assessment of someone who'd handled countless firearms. Her inspection was thorough but subtle, checking the action, examining the barrel crown, testing the trigger pull, all done with movements so natural they seemed unconscious. To the casual observer, She appeared to be simply looking over the rifle, but her evaluation was actually more comprehensive than most shooters would perform on weapons they owned. "This will work fine," she said, accepting the rifle and the basic shooting mat that came with the rental package. "What's the procedure for accessing the longer ranges?" Morrison exchanged glances with another regular, a competitive shooter named David Park, who'd been listening to the conversation while cleaning his custom bolt gun. Both men had spent years developing their long-range skills, investing thousands of dollars in equipment and countless hours in practice. The idea that someone would walk in off the street and expect to shoot at extended distances struck them as naive at best. "Well," Morrison said, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child, "typically you'd want to demonstrate proficiency at shorter distances first. Long-range shooting involves a lot of technical knowledge, ballistics calculations, wind reading, atmospheric conditions. It's not something you just pick up." Park nodded in agreement, his expression suggesting he was trying to be helpful rather than discouraging. "The fundamentals are really important. Breathing, trigger control, consistent positioning. Even experienced hunters usually need time to adapt to precision work." Sarah listened to their advice with polite attention, neither arguing nor dismissing their concerns. She understood that every professional community had its gatekeepers, people who'd earned their expertise through dedication and practice, and who naturally wanted to protect the integrity of their field. Their caution wasn't entirely unreasonable. Long-range shooting was genuinely challenging, and overconfident beginners could be dangerous to themselves and others. "I appreciate the guidance," she said simply. "I'm happy to start wherever you think is appropriate." Chen consulted the range schedule, noting that the 100-yard line had several open positions, while the longer ranges were mostly reserved for regular customers with established track records. The decision seemed obvious: start the newcomer on the basic course and see if she could handle that before considering anything more advanced. "Lane 7 on the 100-yard range," he said, handing her a range assignment card and safety briefing sheet. "Take as much time as you need to get familiar with the rifle. When you're ready, we can discuss moving to longer distances." The dismissal was polite but clear. Sarah was being categorized as a beginner, regardless of what she might claim about her experience. The rental rifle, the basic range assignment, and the condescending advice all reinforced the assumption that she was probably overestimating her abilities and would benefit from a dose of reality. Kelly processed the rental agreement and collected the fees with practiced efficiency, her demeanor friendly but detached. She'd learned not to get invested in the ambitions of new shooters, since most of them left disappointed after discovering that precision shooting required more skill and patience than they'd anticipated. The woman seemed nice enough, but there was something almost sad about watching people set themselves up for obvious failure. "Range rules are on the back of your assignment card," Kelly explained, providing the standard orientation that every new shooter received. "Eye and ear protection mandatory at all times. Red flag means cease fire immediately. Don't advance past the firing line until given permission." "Any questions about safety protocols?" Sarah scanned the rules quickly, her reading speed and comprehension suggesting familiarity with similar procedures. Everything listed was standard range safety protocol, the kind of basic precautions that existed at shooting facilities everywhere. She'd operated under far more complex rules of engagement in environments where the stakes were considerably higher. Morrison watched her walk toward the range entrance, carrying the rental rifle with casual competence that suggested at least basic familiarity with firearms. His initial assessment hadn't changed. She seemed pleasant enough and probably had some shooting experience, but her approach to the situation suggested she didn't really understand what she was attempting. "Think she'll make it through 50 rounds before getting frustrated?" Park asked quietly, his question directed at Morrison but spoken loudly enough that Chen and Kelly could hear. "Depends on her expectations," Morrison replied with the wisdom of someone who'd witnessed similar scenarios countless times. If she's realistic about the learning curve, she might stick with it. But if she's expecting to start making precision shots right away. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Most people underestimated the difficulty of precision shooting until they tried it themselves. The gap between understanding the theory and executing the practice was wider than most newcomers anticipated, and ego often made the lesson more painful than necessary. Chen returned to his paperwork, already mentally categorizing Sarah as another well-intentioned beginner who would probably struggle with the basics before eventually finding a different hobby. The range saw dozens of similar customers every month, people who'd been inspired by movies or television shows or military stories to try their hand at precision shooting, only to discover that real marksmanship required years of dedicated practice to master. What none of them suspected was that the quiet woman now walking toward Lane 7 had already mastered skills that existed far beyond their current understanding, that her casual acceptance of their limitations and assumptions was based not on ignorance or inexperience, but on the patience that came from knowing that demonstration was always more effective than explanation, that the rental rifle in her hands was about to deliver a lesson in precision that would challenge every assumption they'd made about her capabilities. But for now, she was simply another customer heading to the range, another beginner about to learn why precision shooting had earned its reputation as one of the most demanding disciplines in the firearms world. Sarah settled into position at Lane 7 with movements that appeared unremarkable to the casual observer, but actually demonstrated years of ingrained muscle memory. She adjusted the shooting mat with precise, economical motions, positioned the rifle rest at exactly the right height, and checked her sight alignment with the kind of systematic approach that suggested extensive training. To anyone watching, she looked like a competent, recreational shooter going through standard preparations. The 100-yard targets downrange were standard bullseyes, concentric circles designed to provide clear feedback on accuracy and precision. For most shooters, achieving consistent groups within the center rings required significant concentration and technique. For Sarah, these distances represented the kind of shooting she'd mastered before ever encountering truly challenging scenarios. But she approached the task with the same methodical attention she'd learned to apply to everything. Her first shot broke cleanly, the rifle's report echoing across the range with the sharp crack that indicated proper ammunition and a well-maintained barrel. Through her scope, she could see the bullet hole appear just outside the center ring, deliberately placed to suggest competence without revealing exceptional skill. The second and third shots followed at measured intervals, each one carefully positioned to create a respectable but unremarkable group that would meet expectations without raising questions. Morrison, who'd been shooting at the adjacent lane, glanced over at her target through his spotting scope and nodded approvingly. The grouping was actually quite good for someone he'd assumed was a beginner, tight enough to suggest she had decent fundamentals, and steady enough to indicate proper breathing and trigger control. His assessment shifted slightly from complete novice to recreational shooter with some natural ability. "Not bad," he called over during a ceasefire period, his tone carrying the kind of encouragement that experienced shooters offered to promising newcomers. "You've got decent fundamentals. With some practice, you could probably get those groups a lot tighter." Sarah acknowledged the comment with a polite nod, understanding that Morrison was trying to be helpful within the context of his assumptions about her skill level. She continued her methodical shooting routine, placing each shot with the kind of consistency that suggested hours of practice while carefully avoiding the kind of precision that would raise uncomfortable questions about her background. Chen wandered down the firing line during the next ceasefire, his routine inspection bringing him to Sarah's position, just as she was examining her target through binoculars. The grouping was respectable for a newcomer, maybe 4 inches across, with most shots clustered in the higher-scoring rings. Definitely better than average for someone's first session, but nothing that suggested exceptional ability. "How's it feeling?" he asked, his tone friendly but still carrying the slight condescension that shooting instructors unconsciously adopted when dealing with people they perceived as students rather than peers. "The rifle shoots well," Sarah replied, her assessment technically accurate while avoiding any claims about her own performance. "I'm still getting familiar with the trigger." Her response reinforced Chun's impression that she was a thoughtful recreational shooter who understood her limitations. The fact that she focused on equipment rather than making excuses for her shooting suggested a mature approach that many beginners lacked. Still, her performance, while solid, didn't indicate the kind of exceptional ability that would justify advancing to longer ranges. "Take your time getting comfortable," he advised, his words carrying the implicit message that she shouldn't rush into more challenging shooting scenarios. Most people need several sessions to really dial in their fundamentals. As the morning progressed, word of the quiet woman on Lane 7 began circulating among the range regulars with the kind of casual gossip that developed in any close-knit community. Morrison mentioned her decent groupings to park during their lunch break, describing her as someone who might develop into a competent recreational shooter with enough practice and patience. "She's got potential," Morrison said, his assessment delivered with the authority of someone whose opinion carried weight in the local shooting community. "But she's got that look that says she thinks she's better than she actually is. You know, the type probably watched some sniper movies and thinks it looks easy." Park, who'd been observing Sarah's shooting position from his lane, offered his own analysis based on limited observation. "Her form's not terrible, but she's got that stiff, overthinking approach that beginners get. Too focused on technique. Not enough natural flow." Their conversation, conducted within earshot of other shooters during the lunch break, gradually evolved into the kind of casual assessment that communities use to establish hierarchies and define expectations. Sarah became a topic of mild interest, someone who might provide entertainment as she discovered the gap between her apparent ambitions and actual capabilities. Kelly, who'd been watching Sarah's progress through binoculars from the office window, contributed her own observations to the developing narrative. "She keeps asking about the long-range courses," she reported with the kind of amused exasperation that suggested she was dealing with persistent but unrealistic requests. "I've explained the requirements several times, but she doesn't seem to get that you need to prove yourself at basic distances first." The dismissal was becoming more elaborate and collective as the day wore on. What had started as individual assessments from Chun and Morrison was evolving into a group consensus that Sarah was a well-meaning amateur who didn't understand the realities of precision shooting. Her polite persistence in asking about longer ranges was being interpreted as naive stubbornness rather than legitimate interest. Jake Morrison found himself holding court at the coffee station, regaling newer visitors with stories about overconfident beginners who'd learned hard lessons about the difference between confidence and competence. "Last month we had a guy show up claiming he was a natural marksman because he'd done well at a carnival shooting gallery," he said, drawing appreciative chuckles from his audience. "Couldn't hit a paper plate at 50 yards. The story wasn't about Sarah specifically, but the parallel was clear to anyone who'd been listening to the day's conversations. She was being positioned as another example of someone who needed to learn humility before she could develop genuine skill. Chun's assistant mentioned Sarah's inquiries to the afternoon shift, describing her as persistent but unrealistic in her expectations about accessing advanced ranges. The characterization stuck, becoming part of the unofficial assessment that would influence how staff members interacted with her going forward. By mid-afternoon, Sarah had completed several strings of fire, consistently producing respectable but unremarkable groups that reinforced everyone's assumptions about her skill level. Her shooting was competent enough to avoid embarrassment, but not exceptional enough to challenge anyone's preconceptions. She seemed to accept the subtle condescension and gentle discouragement with the kind of patience that suggested she either didn't understand what was happening or had resigned herself to the community's judgment. Morrison approached her during the final ceasefire of the day, his demeanor friendly but tinged with the kind of protective authority that experienced shooters often adopted toward newcomers who might be headed for disappointment. "Listen," he said, his tone suggesting he was about to offer valuable advice based on years of experience. "I know you're interested in the long-range stuff, but it's really important to master the fundamentals first. What you're doing here is good foundation work, but precision shooting at distance involves a whole different set of skills." His words were technically accurate and well-intentioned, but they carried an underlying assumption that Sarah couldn't possibly understand the complexities he was describing. The casual authority in his voice suggested he was speaking to someone who needed guidance, rather than someone who might have legitimate expertise. "I understand the challenges," Sarah replied, her response measured and respectful while revealing nothing about the depth of her actual knowledge. "I appreciate your concern." Her diplomatic response only reinforced Morrison's impression that she was pleasant but naive, someone who thought she understood precision shooting because she'd read about it or watched demonstrations. The gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application was something every serious shooter had to bridge, usually through years of dedicated practice and occasional humbling experiences. What Morrison couldn't see, what none of them could see, was that Sarah's careful mediocrity was entirely deliberate, that her respectful acceptance of their limitations was based not on ignorance, but on strategic patience, that every shot she'd fired had been precisely placed to maintain her cover while she assessed the facility, the equipment, and the people who would soon witness something that would forever change their understanding of what was possible. Sarah returned to Ironclad Tactical Range the following Tuesday, arriving at the same time with the same quiet purposefulness that had characterized her first visit. She carried the same worn backpack, wore similarly unremarkable clothing, and approached the front desk with the same measured politeness that had defined her previous interactions. To Chen and his staff, her return confirmed their assessment that she was a dedicated recreational shooter who understood the value of consistent practice. "Back for more fundamentals work?" Shun asked, his greeting friendly but tinged with the kind of protective guidance that range masters offered to customers they wanted to see succeed within realistic expectations. He'd reviewed her performance notes from the previous session. Competent but unremarkable shooting that suggested natural ability constrained by limited experience. "I was hoping to try the 300-yard range today," Sarah said, her request delivered with the same calm directness she'd shown when asking about the 1,000-yard course. "I've been working on my fundamentals." The request wasn't unreasonable, but it represented a significant jump from her previous session. Shun's standard protocol required demonstrated proficiency at intermediate distances before advancing to longer ranges, partly for safety reasons and partly to prevent customer frustration. Moving from 100-yard targets to 300-yard precision required understanding atmospheric conditions, ballistic calculations, and equipment limitations that most recreational shooters took months to develop. "Let's see how you do at 200 first," Chen suggested, his compromise reflecting both caution and genuine desire to help her progress at an appropriate pace. "The wind conditions are tricky today, and that extra distance makes everything more challenging." Sarah accepted the modification without argument, her response demonstrating the kind of flexibility that Chen appreciated in customers. She understood that range management involved balancing individual ambitions with safety considerations and facility policies. Her willingness to work within the system, rather than demanding special treatment, reinforced his impression that she was mature and coachable. Morrison arrived shortly after Sarah had signed in, his Tuesday routine bringing him to the range for precision practice before the afternoon crowd arrived. He noticed Sarah's presence with mild interest, remembering her as the polite newcomer who'd shown decent fundamentals during her first session. Her return suggested genuine commitment to improving her shooting skills, which he respected even if he questioned her ultimate aspirations. "How'd she do last week?" Morrison asked Chen quietly, his inquiry reflecting the informal mentorship role that experienced shooters often adopted toward promising newcomers. The shooting community was generally supportive of people who showed genuine dedication to the craft, even if their initial abilities were limited. "Solid fundamentals, realistic groups for a beginner," Chen replied, his assessment based on carefully documented performance metrics. "She's persistent about wanting to try longer ranges, but she seems willing to work through the progression properly." Morrison nodded approvingly, his opinion of Sarah improving slightly based on evidence of patient dedication. Too many newcomers wanted to skip directly to advanced challenges without mastering basic skills, an approach that usually led to frustration and eventual abandonment of the sport. Sarah's willingness to return and continue developing her fundamentals suggested she might have the temperament for serious precision shooting. At the 200-yard line, Sarah began her shooting routine with the same methodical approach she'd demonstrated during her first visit. Her preparation was thorough but unremarkable, checking wind flags, adjusting her scope for the increased distance, and settling into a shooting position that appeared competent without being exceptional. Her movements suggested someone who'd studied proper technique and was working to implement it consistently. The targets at 200 yards were smaller and more challenging than the 100-yard bullseyes, requiring greater precision and more sophisticated understanding of external ballistics. Wind became a significant factor at this distance, with even gentle breezes capable of deflecting bullets enough to turn center shots into marginal hits. Most recreational shooters needed considerable practice to achieve consistent accuracy at this range. Sarah's first group was respectable but not remarkable, clustering within a 6-inch circle that indicated solid fundamentals while leaving obvious room for improvement. Her shooting pace was measured and deliberate, each shot preceded by careful observation of wind conditions and systematic verification of her shooting position. To observers, she appeared to be working methodically through the challenges that 200-yard shooting presented. Kelly, who'd been monitoring range activities from the office, noticed that Sarah's shooting routine differed from most recreational shooters in subtle but significant ways. Where others often became frustrated with missed shots or excited about successful groups, Sarah maintained the same calm focus regardless of her target results. Her emotional equilibrium suggested either exceptional self-discipline or experience with high-pressure situations. "She's got interesting composure," Kelly mentioned to Chen during a quiet period, her observation based on watching Sarah's reaction to both successful and unsuccessful shots. "Most people get more emotional about their performance, especially when they're still learning." Chen glanced toward Sarah's position, noting the steady rhythm of her shooting and the systematic way she approached each shot. Her behavior was professional in a way that exceeded what he typically saw from recreational shooters, suggesting either unusual natural temperament or training that extended beyond basic marksmanship instruction. During the lunch break, Morrison approached Sarah's shooting position to examine her target, his inspection motivated by genuine curiosity about her progress rather than condescension. The grouping was tighter than he'd expected, showing improvement from her previous session and suggesting she was genuinely learning from her practice. "Nice work," he said, his compliment carrying more sincerity than his previous comments. "You're showing real improvement. How long have you been shooting?" "On and off for a while," Sarah replied, her answer technically accurate while revealing nothing specific about the duration or intensity of her experience. "I'm still learning." Her response demonstrated the kind of humility that Morrison respected. But something about her delivery suggested depths that her words didn't reveal. There was a quality to her voice that reminded him of military instructors he'd encountered, People who possessed extensive knowledge, but chose to share it strategically rather than displaying it for effect. Park, who'd been observing Sarah's shooting from an adjacent lane, joined the conversation with his own assessment of her performance. "Your breathing technique looks solid," he observed, his comment reflecting genuine expertise in precision shooting fundamentals. "Have you had formal instruction?" "Some," Sarah answered, her brevity consistent with her pattern of providing minimal information about her background. "I try to focus on the basics." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Morrison and Park offering technical advice about wind reading and ballistic calculations that Sarah received with polite attention. Her responses suggested she understood their explanations, but her questions were basic enough to reinforce their assumption that she was still developing fundamental knowledge. What they didn't notice was how Sarah's questions were carefully crafted to extract information about range procedures, equipment capabilities, and the skill levels of regular customers. Her inquiries appeared to seek guidance but actually served to map the tactical environment and assess the capabilities of potential observers for future demonstrations. Chen approached the group during their discussion, his presence adding official authority to the informal mentorship session that was developing around Sarah's shooting position. He'd been reviewing range records and noticed that Sarah's documented performance was showing steady improvement across multiple metrics. "How are you feeling about moving to 300 yards?" he asked, his question reflecting both recognition of her progress and continued caution about advancing too quickly. "Your groups are getting more consistent, but the longer distances add a lot of complexity." "I'd like to try it," Sarah said, her response maintaining the same calm persistence she'd shown since her first visit. "I understand it's more challenging." Her continued interest in longer ranges, despite repeated explanations about the increased difficulty, was beginning to intrigue rather than concern the range staff. Most recreational shooters either became discouraged by the technical demands of precision shooting or satisfied with their current level of performance. Sarah's quiet determination to advance suggested either unusual dedication or confidence. Based on experience that she hadn't fully disclosed, Morrison found himself reconsidering his initial assessment of Sarah's capabilities and motivations. Her consistent performance, combined with her systematic approach to skill development, suggested someone who understood that precision shooting required patient progression through increasingly complex challenges. Her behavior was beginning to remind him of military and law enforcement shooters he'd encountered, people who approached marksmanship as a serious discipline rather than recreational activity. "Tell you what," Chen said, his decision representing both recognition of Sarah's progress and curiosity about her actual potential. "Tomorrow morning, if conditions are good, we'll set you up on the 300-yard range. That'll give us a better sense of what you're really capable of." Sarah accepted the opportunity with the same composed gratitude she'd shown throughout her interactions at the range, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The change was subtle enough that casual observers missed it entirely, but it suggested someone preparing for a demonstration that would require accessing capabilities they'd been carefully concealing. Word of Sarah's progression to the 300-yard range spread through Ironclad's informal communication network with the efficiency that characterized any close-knit community. By Wednesday evening, her advancement had become a topic of conversation among the regulars, who gathered for the weekly Precision Shooting Club meeting in the range's conference room. The discussion wasn't malicious, but it carried the kind of amused skepticism that experienced shooters often displayed toward ambitious newcomers. "Chun's letting the waitress try 300 yards tomorrow," Morrison announced to the assembled group, his words accompanied by the knowing chuckles that greeted most range gossip. "She's been pretty persistent about moving up to longer distances." The nickname had emerged naturally from conversations about Sarah's background, based on her modest appearance and the assumption that someone without Obvious military or law enforcement credentials, probably worked in the service industry. Nobody had actually asked about her employment, but the label fit their collective impression of someone whose shooting aspirations exceeded her likely experience. Tom Bradley, a retired police sniper who'd been shooting at Ironclad for 8 years, shook his head with the weary amusement of someone who'd witnessed similar scenarios countless times. "Let me guess," he said, his voice carrying the authority of professional experience. "She thinks precision shooting is about buying the right equipment and following a checklist. Probably spent hours on YouTube watching tactical videos." The observation drew appreciative nods from other club members who'd encountered their share of overconfident beginners. The gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application was something every serious shooter had to bridge, usually through years of dedicated practice and occasional humbling, experiences that taught respect for the craft's complexity. Park contributed his own assessment based on observing Sarah's shooting sessions over the past week. "She's got decent fundamentals, I'll give her that," he said, his tone suggesting he was trying to be fair despite obvious reservations. "But there's something about her attitude that bugs me. Too calm, too confident. Like she thinks she knows something we don't." His observation touched on something that several club members had noticed but hadn't articulated clearly. Sarah's composure was unusual for someone at her apparent skill level, suggesting either exceptional natural temperament or misplaced confidence that would eventually be corrected by reality. Her persistent interest in longer ranges, despite repeated explanations about the increased difficulty, was beginning to irritate people who'd invested years in developing their own capabilities. Frank Rodriguez, a competitive shooter who'd won several regional championships, offered his own theory about Sarah's motivations and likely outcome. "I've seen this before," he said with the authority of extensive experience. "Someone reads about military snipers or watches too many movies and thinks they can skip the fundamentals. She'd probably struggle with wind calls at 300 and realize this isn't as easy as it looks." The club's informal leader, a former Marine instructor named Bill Hayes, listened to the various assessments with the kind of analytical attention that had made him an effective teacher during his military career. He'd observed Sarah briefly during one of her range sessions and noticed details that others had missed, but his observations led to questions rather than conclusions. "Has anyone actually talked to her about her background?" Hayes asked, his question cutting through the speculation with characteristic directness. "I mean really talked to her, not just offered advice about fundamentals?" Morrison shrugged, his response indicating that he'd assumed Sarah's history was obvious from her appearance and behavior. Military service on her paperwork, but that could mean anything. Probably did her basic training and thinks that makes her a marksman. The assumption was reasonable based on their collective experience with people who conflated basic military service with specialized shooting skills. Most service members received fundamental marksmanship training, but precision shooting at extended ranges required additional instruction that only select personnel received. The vast majority of military veterans, while competent with firearms, weren't qualified for the kind of shooting that Ironclad's advanced ranges demanded. Kelly, who'd been listening to the conversation while organizing club paperwork, contributed her own observations about Sarah's behavior and requests. "She keeps asking very specific questions about our longest ranges," she reported with the kind of exasperation that suggested persistent but unrealistic inquiries. "Wants to know about wind conditions, target systems, maximum distances. It's like she's planning something that's way beyond her current level." Her comment reinforced the group's collective impression that Sarah was someone whose ambition significantly exceeded her capabilities. The questions Kelly described were the kind that serious long-range shooters asked, but coming from someone with Sarah's apparent experience level, they suggested either naive optimism or fundamental misunderstanding of what Precision shooting actually required. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with various club members sharing their theories about Sarah's background, motivations, and likely performance at longer ranges. The consensus was that she was well-meaning but unrealistic, someone who would benefit from a reality check that tomorrow's session at 300 yards would probably provide. $5 says she can't keep 10 shots in a 12-inch circle. At 300, Bradley offered his wager based on professional assessment of what constituted reasonable expectations for someone with Sarah's apparent experience. Wind's supposed to be gusty tomorrow, and that's where the beginners really start to struggle. Park accepted the bet with a slight modification. I'll take that action, but I think she'd do okay with the shooting. What's going to get her is the frustration when she realizes how much more complicated everything becomes at distance. Most people expect linear progression and get discouraged when they hit the reality wall. Their predictions reflected genuine understanding of the challenges that extended range shooting presented, but they were based on assumptions about Sarah's experience and temperament that hadn't been properly tested. The betting pool that developed around her likely performance became another layer in the community's collective assessment of her capabilities. Chen, who'd initially planned to attend the club meeting, had been delayed by administrative duties and arrived just as the conversation about Sarah was reaching its conclusion. He listened to the various predictions and assessments with professional interest, noting that the group's expectations aligned with his own cautious optimism about her progress. What's the worst that happens? He asked, his question directed at the group's collective concerns about advancing Sarah too quickly. If she struggles, it's a learning experience. If she does well, maybe we've got another serious shooter in the community. His pragmatic approach reflected years of experience managing recreational shooters with varying levels of ability and ambition. The range existed to serve customers safely while helping them develop their skills, and Sarah had followed all proper procedures while demonstrating steady improvement. Her advancement to longer ranges was a natural progression that deserved opportunity rather than skepticism. Hayes, however, remained quietly troubled by details that others had dismissed or overlooked. Sarah's questions were more sophisticated than they appeared. Her composure was more professional than recreational shooters typically displayed, and her persistent interest in the range's capabilities suggested familiarity with precision shooting that extended beyond basic training. "I'd like to observe her session tomorrow," Hayes said, his request based on genuine curiosity rather than entertainment. "Something about her doesn't quite add up, and I want to see how she handles the increased complexity." His comment introduced a note of seriousness into what had been largely dismissive speculation. Hayes's reputation for accurate assessment of shooting talent made his observations carry additional weight, and his expressed interest in observing Sarah's performance suggested there might be more to evaluate than the group had assumed. Morrison accepted Hayes's perspective with the respect due to someone whose judgment had proven reliable over many years. "Maybe you're right," he conceded, his tone suggesting he was willing to reconsider his assumptions. "Could be we're underestimating her based on appearances." The possibility that they might be wrong about Sarah's capabilities introduced an element of uncertainty into the group's collective assessment, but most members remained confident that tomorrow's session would validate their expectations. 300-yard shooting would reveal whether Sarah's quiet persistence was based on genuine competence or misplaced confidence, and the range's experienced community would finally understand what kind of shooter they'd been observing. What none of them suspected was that Sarah had been conducting her own assessment of their capabilities, their attitudes, and their expectations. That her careful progression through their systems was as strategic as it was patient. That tomorrow's demonstration would provide answers to questions they didn't know they should be asking, and reveal capabilities that would challenge every assumption they'd made about the quiet woman who'd walked into their world asking politely for range time. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, desert air that precision shooters prayed for: minimal wind, clear visibility, and atmospheric conditions that would minimize the variables affecting long-range accuracy. Sarah arrived at Ironclad precisely at opening time, her punctuality suggesting either respect for scheduled appointments or familiarity with operational planning that treated timing as a critical factor rather than a casual consideration. Chen was preparing the 300-yard range when she entered, his early arrival driven by genuine curiosity about how she would handle the increased complexity of extended-range shooting. The target systems at this distance were more sophisticated than the simple bullseyes used for basic training, featuring scoring rings that demanded precision measured in inches rather than the forgiving margins that characterized shorter ranges. "Ready for the real test?" Chen asked, his greeting carrying the kind of encouraging challenge that range masters use to motivate customers while managing expectations. 300 yards is where shooting starts getting interesting. Sarah acknowledged his comment with the same composed politeness she'd maintained throughout her interactions at the range, but something in her posture suggested a subtle shift from student to practitioner. The change was almost imperceptible, but it indicated someone transitioning from learning mode to performance mode in ways that suggested extensive experience with high-stakes demonstrations. Bill Hayes arrived shortly after Sarah had begun her equipment setup, his presence at the range motivated by the curiosity he'd expressed during the previous evening's club meeting. As a former Marine sniper instructor with 22 years of military experience, Hayes possessed the kind of analytical eye that could assess shooting capabilities through subtle indicators that most people missed entirely. He positioned himself at a discrete observation point where he could monitor Sarah's shooting routine without interfering with her concentration or creating the kind of pressure that might affect performance. His initial assessment focused on the technical aspects of her preparation, how she organized her equipment, adjusted her shooting position, and approached the systematic challenges that 300-yard precision demanded. What Hayes observed during the first few minutes of Sarah's setup routine triggered recognition patterns based on decades of professional experience. Her movements were economical in ways that suggested training that extended far beyond recreational shooting instruction. She adjusted her scope with the kind of systematic precision that indicated familiarity with equipment modifications under field conditions. Her breathing pattern was controlled and economical, suggesting someone who understood that oxygen management was crucial for sustained accuracy under stress. Most significantly, Hayes noticed how Sarah positioned her support equipment. Her spare ammunition was organized with military efficiency. Her shooting notebook was positioned for easy reference during rapid consultations, and her backup equipment was arranged in patterns that would allow immediate access without visual confirmation. These were the kinds of operational habits that developed only through extensive experience in environments where equipment failure could have serious consequences. Sarah's first shot at 300 yards broke cleanly, the rifle's report echoing across the range with the sharp authority that indicated proper ammunition selection and optimal barrel harmonics. Through his spotting scope, Hayes watched the bullet impact with precision that significantly exceeded what he'd expected based on the range. Community's assessment of her capabilities. The shot placement wasn't just accurate, it was exactly where an experienced shooter would place a first round to establish baseline conditions for subsequent shots. Not center mass, which would indicate lucky shooting or basic competence, but positioned to provide maximum information about wind conditions, scope adjustment, and ammunition performance. It was the kind of strategic shot placement that indicated systematic approach to precision shooting that most recreational shooters never developed. Hayes felt something cold settle in his stomach as he continued observing Sarah's shooting routine. Her second shot was placed with mathematical precision relative to the first, creating a reference pattern that would allow her to calculate corrections for atmospheric conditions and equipment variations. Her third shot completed a triangle, That provided comprehensive data about how her rifle was performing under current conditions. This wasn't recreational shooting or even advanced hobby-level precision work. This was tactical marksmanship executed by someone who understood that accurate shooting was only one component of a larger system that included reconnaissance, target analysis, and mission planning. Hayes had trained hundreds of military snipers, and he recognized the approach Sarah was demonstrating. During the ceasefire period, Hayes approached Sarah's shooting position with the kind of professional courtesy that one expert extended to another. His demeanor had shifted from curious observation to respectful assessment, based on mounting evidence that suggested capabilities far beyond what anyone at the range had suspected. "Excuse me," Hayes said, his voice carrying the formal politeness that military professionals used when uncertain about protocol or rank. "I couldn't help but notice your shooting technique. Mind if I ask where you developed that approach?" Sarah looked up from her shooting notebook, her green eyes meeting Hayes's gaze with the kind of direct assessment that suggested she was evaluating his qualifications to ask such questions. Something in her expression indicated recognition of a fellow professional, but her response remained carefully measured. "I've had some instruction," she replied, her answer maintaining the same strategic ambiguity she'd employed throughout her interactions at the range. "I try to be systematic about it." Hayes studied her face with the analytical attention he'd learned to apply during personnel assessments, noting details that confirmed his growing suspicions about her background. Her tan lines indicated extensive time spent outdoors under harsh conditions, but in patterns that suggested equipment use rather than recreational activities. Her hands showed calluses consistent with extensive weapons handling, but located in ways that indicated precision rifle work rather than general military service. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Most significantly, Hayes noticed how Sarah positioned herself during their conversation. She maintained visual contact with multiple approach routes while keeping her dominant hand free and her body positioned to allow rapid movement if necessary. These were unconscious habits that developed only through extensive experience in potentially hostile environments. "What unit?" Hayes asked quietly, his question direct enough to demand a response while maintaining plausible deniability. If he'd misread the situation. Sarah's pause lasted exactly long enough to suggest she was making a tactical decision about how much information to reveal. When she spoke, her voice carried a different quality, still controlled, but with undertones that indicated professional recognition of a fellow specialist. "Various assignments," she said, her response confirming Hayes' suspicions while revealing nothing that could compromise operational security. "I spent some time in specialized roles." The phrase "specialized roles" was military euphemism that Hayes understood perfectly. It indicated assignment to units whose missions weren't discussed in casual conversation and whose existence was often denied by official sources. Combined with Sarah's demonstrated shooting capabilities and operational habits, it painted a picture that explained everything about her behavior at the range. Hayes felt his pulse quicken as the implications of Sarah's presence at Ironclad became clear. She wasn't a recreational shooter, learning precision techniques. She was a former special operations marksman, whose capabilities existed at levels that most civilian shooters couldn't comprehend. Her patient progression through the range's systems wasn't about learning fundamentals, but about assessing facilities and personnel in preparation for some kind of demonstration. "How long since you've had access to proper facilities?" Hayes asked, his question based on understanding that specialized military personnel often lost access to advanced training resources after leaving service. "Too long," Sarah replied, her answer containing the first hint of emotion she displayed during any of her interactions at the range. "I've been making do with basic civilian facilities." The admission confirmed Hayes' assessment that Sarah had been operating under significant constraints, using Ironclad's resources not for training, but for the opportunity to access equipment and ranges that matched her actual capabilities. Her careful performance at shorter distances hadn't been about developing skills, but about maintaining operational security while evaluating the facility's potential for more advanced demonstrations. Hayes understood that he was witnessing something unprecedented, a former special operations marksman, preparing to reveal capabilities that would fundamentally change how everyone at the range understood precision shooting. The question was whether the community was prepared for the demonstration that was obviously coming, and whether they possessed the professional maturity to handle revelations that would challenge every assumption they'd made about the quiet woman who'd been asking politely for range time. Something in Sarah's posture suggested that the careful progression was about to end, that whatever demonstration she'd been planning was approaching implementation. Hayes realized he was about to witness something that would become legend in the precision shooting community, and he hoped the revelation wouldn't destroy the careers and confidence of people who'd made honest mistakes based on incomplete information. Hayes stepped closer to Sarah's shooting position, his movement deliberate and respectful in the way that senior military personnel approach situations requiring delicate handling. His trained eye had caught additional details during their brief conversation, subtle indicators that painted a picture of someone whose service record existed in the classified shadows of military operations that never appeared in official histories. Sarah Martinez, Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of recognition rather than mere identification. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to Task Force Green. The words hung in the desert air like a revelation that changed the fundamental nature of everything that had transpired at Ironclad over the past week. Sarah's composure didn't crack, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle transition from carefully maintained civilian anonymity to the bearing of someone whose cover had been professionally penetrated by someone qualified to understand the implications. "That was a long time ago," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining the same controlled tone she'd used throughout her interactions at the range, but now carrying undertones that acknowledged the futility of continued deception in the face of expert recognition. Hayes felt his pulse quicken as additional pieces of the puzzle fell into place with the horrifying clarity of someone who'd spent years in the special operations community and understood exactly what Sarah's assignment history represented. Task Force Green wasn't a unit that appeared on organizational charts or recruitment posters. It was the kind of designation that existed only in classified briefings and after-action reports that were buried so deep in government archives that their existence was denied by multiple agencies. Afghanistan 2019, Hayes continued, his voice barely above a whisper as operational security considerations warred with the need to confirm what he was beginning to suspect. Operation Silent Thunder, the Helmand Province insertion that officially never happened. Sarah's green eyes met his, with the kind of direct assessment that confirmed everything Hayes feared and suspected. She wasn't just a former military marksman, she was one of the most decorated female snipers in special operations history, someone whose mission record included achievements that redefined what was considered possible in precision shooting. Under combat conditions, 17 confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 800 meters, Hayes said, his words based on classified briefings he'd attended during his final years of service, including the shot that neutralized the Taliban commander directing the ambush at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Single shot, crosswind conditions, target moving at combat speed. The specific details Hayes was reciting weren't public knowledge, they existed only in classified after-action reports and intelligence summaries that were restricted to personnel with specialized clearances and operational need to know. His ability to cite them with precision, confirmed that his own background included access to information about missions that most military personnel never learned existed. You were awarded the Silver Star for that operation, Hayes continued, his voice carrying the respect due to someone whose service had literally saved the lives of American forces in combat. But the citation was classified, the ceremony was closed, and your name was redacted from all official records to protect operational security for ongoing missions. Sarah's response was measured and careful, acknowledging the accuracy of Hayes's information while maintaining the operational discipline that had defined her military career. Some things are better left in the past, she said, her words carrying the weight of someone who understood that certain achievements came with prices that extended far beyond public recognition. The conversation was taking place during a ceasefire period, but other shooters on the range were beginning to notice the intensity of the discussion taking place at Sarah's shooting position. Morrison, who'd been observing Sarah's target through his spotting scope, had noted the exceptional accuracy of her 300-yard groups and was approaching to offer congratulations on her obvious improvement. Hayes realized that the careful progression Sarah had maintained through the range's systems was about to collapse as word of her true identity spread through the community. The polite dismissal and casual condescension she'd endured were about to be revealed as horrific misjudgments of someone whose capabilities existed at levels that none of them could have imagined. Morrison's coming over, Hayes said quietly, his warning based on understanding that Sarah might prefer to control how information about her background was revealed to the broader community. You want me to handle this? Let it happen, Sarah replied, her decision suggesting someone who'd grown tired of concealing capabilities that represented years of dedicated service in the most demanding environments imaginable. Maybe it's time. Morrison reached their position just as Sarah was making final adjustments to her scope for her next string of fire. His expression was enthusiastic, reflecting genuine pleasure at seeing a recreational shooter make obvious progress in developing precision shooting skills. Those are some impressive groups, Morrison said, his compliment based on target analysis that showed significantly tighter shot placement than he'd expected from someone with Sarah's apparent experience level. You're really starting to get the hang of this long-range stuff. Hayes felt a combination of embarrassment and dread as he watched Morrison deliver praise that revealed how completely the range community had misunderstood the situation. Sarah Martinez wasn't learning precision shooting. She was one of the finest military marksmen of her generation, someone whose combat achievements existed at levels that Morrison couldn't begin to comprehend. Morrison, Hayes said carefully, his voice carrying the gravity of someone about to deliver information that would fundamentally change how everyone present understood their situation. I think there's something you need to know about our friend here. Sarah looked up from her rifle preparation, her expression indicating that she was prepared for whatever revelation Hayes was about to make. The careful anonymity she'd maintained throughout her time at Ironclad was about to end, replaced by recognition of achievements that would transform her from dismissed newcomer to respected legend in the space of a single conversation. Sarah isn't exactly a recreational shooter, Hayes continued, his words chosen to prepare Morrison for information that would challenge every assumption he'd made over the past week. She's former special operations, with a combat record that includes some of the most difficult precision shots ever documented. Morrison's expression shifted from friendly encouragement to confused uncertainty as he processed Hayes's words. The possibility that the quiet woman he'd been offering basic shooting advice possessed military credentials that exceeded his own experience wasn't something he'd considered even remotely possible. Special operations? Morrison repeated, his voice carrying the kind of disbelief that came from having fundamental assumptions challenged by evidence that didn't fit established patterns. But she said she was just learning. Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of making decisions under conditions where accuracy meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "I said I was still learning," she corrected. "Gently, that's always true. But I've been shooting professionally for longer than most people here have been alive." The revelation hit Morrison with the force of someone discovering that the person they'd been treating as a novice was actually a master craftsman whose expertise existed at levels they couldn't even recognize. His face flushed with embarrassment as he realized the implications of the advice he'd been offering and the assumptions he'd been making about her capabilities. Hayes watched Morrison's reaction with professional sympathy, understanding that the range community's misjudgment of Sarah represented an honest mistake based on incomplete information rather than deliberate disrespect. But the gap between perception and reality was so vast that the correction would inevitably be devastating for people who'd invested their identities in being knowledgeable about precision shooting. "How was I supposed to know?" Morrison asked, his question directed at Hayes but carrying the broader implications of someone whose expertise had been revealed as inadequate for recognizing true excellence when it appeared in unexpected forms. "You weren't," Sarah replied, her response carrying the patience of someone who'd learned that being underestimated was often more useful than being recognized. That was the point. Word of Sarah's true identity spread through Ironclad with the velocity of supersonic ammunition, reaching every corner of the facility within minutes as shocked staff members and stunned customers processed the implications of what Hayes had revealed. The quiet woman they'd dismissed as an overly ambitious newcomer was a decorated special operations veteran whose combat achievements existed in the classified archives of the world's most elite military units. Chen received the news while reviewing range schedules in his office, the information delivered by Kelly with the kind of breathless urgency that accompanied truly significant developments. His first reaction was disbelief, followed rapidly by the sinking realization that his facility had spent a week treating a genuine military legend with the casual condescension typically reserved for overconfident beginners. "Get everyone to the observation deck," Chen instructed, his decision based on understanding that Sarah's demonstration was about to provide a masterclass in precision shooting that would redefine everyone's understanding of what was actually possible with a rifle. "And call the advanced course instructors. They need to see this." On the 300-yard range, Sarah had completed her final equipment checks with the systematic precision of someone preparing for a mission rather than a recreational shooting session. Her movements were economical and purposeful, each action serving a specific function in the complex choreography of preparation that preceded truly exceptional marksmanship demonstrations. Morrison stood beside Hayes, his earlier confidence completely evaporated as he watched Sarah transition from the careful recreational shooter he'd been mentoring to the lethal professional she'd always been. Her posture had changed subtly but definitively, reflecting years of training in environments where precision shooting was a matter of life and death rather than recreational achievement. "What kind of shot is she planning?" Morrison asked quietly, his question reflecting genuine curiosity, mixed with apprehension about witnessing capabilities that existed far beyond his own experience level. "Something that will make us all feel like beginners," Hayes replied, his assessment based on understanding that special operations marksmen didn't reveal their identities without planning demonstrations that would justify the security risk involved. In such disclosure, Sarah had positioned herself at a shooting station that provided maximum visibility for the growing crowd of observers while offering optimal sight lines to targets that extended far beyond the 300-yard range where she'd been assigned. Her scope was adjusted for extreme distance shooting, and her ammunition selection consisted of match-grade rounds, designed for precision work at ranges that most civilian shooters never attempted. The first indication that something extraordinary was developing came Sarah requested permission to engage targets at the range's maximum distance, steel plate positioned at 800 yards that was typically used only for equipment testing and advanced instructor demonstrations. The target was barely visible to the naked eye, appearing as a small speck against the desert backdrop that required optical magnification just to identify clearly. 800 yards? Shun asked, his question reflecting both surprise and concern about the liability implications of allowing such an extreme demonstration. That's beyond our normal customer protocols. I understand, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd made similar shots under far more challenging conditions. I'll assume full responsibility for the demonstration. Hayes nodded his approval, understanding that Sarah's request represented an opportunity for the range community to witness precision shooting at levels that most of them had only read about in military histories and technical manuals. The demonstration would serve as both vindication for Sarah and education for everyone who'd underestimated her capabilities. The crowd on the observation deck grew larger as word continued to spread throughout the facility. Competitive shooters, military veterans, law enforcement personnel, and recreational marksmen gathered to witness what promised to be an unprecedented display of precision shooting skills. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and nervous energy as people prepared to see whether the legendary reputation matched actual performance. Sarah settled into her shooting position with movements that reflected thousands of hours of practice under conditions that ranged from controlled training environments to active combat zones. Her breathing pattern was controlled and economical, her body position optimized for stability during extended shooting sessions, and her grip on the rifle demonstrated the kind of professional competence that separated true experts from talented amateurs. The first shot at 800 yards broke cleanly, the rifle's report echoing across the range with authority that commanded attention from everyone present. Through spotting scopes, observers watched the bullet impact with precision that defied reasonable expectations, striking the steel target with the kind of accuracy that most shooters couldn't achieve at half the distance, under perfect conditions. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her second shot struck the same target with mechanical precision, followed by a third and fourth that created a group so tight it appeared to be a single enlarged whole when viewed through high magnification optics. The demonstration was methodical and overwhelming, each shot confirming that the previous had been the result of skill rather than luck. Then the sound of rotor blades appeared on the horizon, growing louder as a civilian helicopter approached the range boundary on what appeared to be a routine training flight. The aircraft was maintaining legal altitude and distance from the active shooting area, but its presence created an unexpected element that transformed the demonstration from impressive to legendary. Challenge accepted, Sarah said quietly, her words directed at Hayes but audible to the microphones that BROADC SD range communications to the observation deck. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed for years afterward by everyone present. Sarah tracked the helicopter's movement with her scope, calculating lead angles and atmospheric conditions with the kind of instantaneous mental processing that represented the pinnacle of marksmanship skill. Her shot, when it came, was perfectly timed and placed with surgical precision. The helicopter's radio antenna, a small target moving at significant speed and distance, disappeared in a shower of sparks as Sarah's bullet found its mark with the kind of accuracy that redefined everyone's understanding of what was possible in precision shooting. The aircraft's pilot, initially confused by the sudden communications failure, quickly realized what had occurred and departed the area with newfound respect for the capabilities being demonstrated below. The observation deck erupted in stunned silence, followed by incredulous applause as witnesses processed what they'd just observed. The shot was technically impossible according to conventional wisdom, but they'd watched it happen with their own eyes under conditions that eliminated any possibility of luck or coincidence. Sarah Martinez had just demonstrated why she'd earned her legendary status in the special operations community, and why the respectful fear she'd inspired in combat zones was entirely justified by capabilities that existed beyond the comprehension of most professional marksmen. The silence that followed Sarah's impossible shot lasted exactly 17 seconds, measured by the digital clock on the range's scoring system, before erupting into the kind of chaos that accompanies events that fundamentally alter people's understanding of reality. Veteran shooters who dedicated decades to mastering their craft stood slack-jawed as they processed what they'd witnessed, while newer enthusiasts fumbled for their phones to capture evidence that no one would believe without documentation. Chen descended from the observation deck with movements that reflected the urgency of someone whose professional reputation required immediate damage control. His facility had just hosted a demonstration that would become legendary in the precision shooting community, but it had also revealed systematic failures in judgment that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved in the original. Dismissal. Jesus Christ, Sarah, Chen said as he approached her shooting position, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and professional concern that reflected the complexity of the situation. That was a helicopter. A moving helicopter at what? 1,200 yards? Approximately, Sarah replied, her tone maintaining the same controlled professionalism she displayed throughout her time at Ironclad, even as she methodically secured her rifle and began organizing her equipment with military precision. The range was manageable with proper lead calculation. Her casual assessment of the shot's technical difficulty only deepened the surreal quality of the moment for observers who understood that what they'd witnessed represented capabilities that existed at the theoretical limits of human marksmanship. Morrison stood nearby, his earlier confidence completely shattered as he contemplated the implications of having offered basic shooting advice to someone whose skills exceeded anything in his experience. Hayes approached the group with expressions that mixed professional admiration with personal embarrassment, understanding that his own delayed recognition of Sarah's identity represented a failure of the assessment skills he'd prided himself on throughout his military career. The fact that she'd been operating under their noses for a week without detection spoke to both her operational discipline and their collective blindness to excellence that didn't conform to expected patterns. "Ma'am," Hayes said, his words carrying the formal respect that military professionals extended to achievements that transcended normal recognition, "I owe you an apology for not recognizing who you were immediately. That kind of oversight is inexcusable from someone with my background." Sarah's response demonstrated the grace under pressure that had characterized her interactions throughout the week, even as the situation transformed from careful anonymity to public recognition. "No apology necessary," she said simply. Operational security was maintained exactly as intended. The observation deck was experiencing its own reckoning as the crowd of witnesses processed both the demonstration they'd observed and their own participation in the systematic underestimation that had preceded it. Competitive shooters who'd spent years perfecting their techniques were confronting the reality that true excellence existed at levels they'd never imagined, while recreational enthusiasts were discovering that their casual assumptions about shooting ability had been completely inadequate for recognizing genuine expertise. Park found himself reviewing every interaction he'd had with Sarah, replaying conversations where he'd offered advice about fundamentals to someone whose mastery of those same fundamentals had been developed in combat zones where imperfection meant death. The memory of explaining wind reading techniques to a woman who'd made precision shots in the Hindu Kush mountains created a level of personal embarrassment that bordered on professional crisis. Kelly was experiencing her own professional reckoning as she contemplated her role in the systematic dismissal that had characterized Sarah's treatment at the facility. Her casual categorization of Sarah as persistent but unrealistic now appeared as evidence of judgment failures that raised questions about her ability to assess customer capabilities accurately. "I need to make some calls," Chen announced his decision based on understanding that the demonstration had created obligations that extended beyond simple apology or recognition. "There are people who need to know about this, and protocols that need to be followed." His words reflected the reality that Sarah's public demonstration had potential implications for military security, media attention, and the range's relationship with various government agencies that might have interests in her activities and current status. The carefully controlled environment that had allowed her anonymous practice was about to become significantly more complicated. Sarah understood the implications of Chen's concerns, but her decision to reveal her capabilities had been deliberate and calculated. "The demonstration was necessary," she said, her explanation directed at Chen, but audible to the larger group that had gathered around her shooting position. "Sometimes people need to see what's possible before they can understand what they're looking at." Morrison finally found his voice, though his words carried the strained quality of someone whose professional identity had been fundamentally challenged by recent events. "How long have you been? I mean, when did you retire from active duty?" 3 years ago, Sarah replied, her answer providing context that made her presence at civilian shooting facilities more understandable while raising additional questions about why someone with her capabilities had chosen to practice in relative anonymity rather than seeking recognition for her achievements. The crowd began to disperse gradually as people processed what they'd witnessed and considered its implications for their own understanding of precision shooting. Some approached Sarah directly to express admiration and request additional information about her background, while others maintained respectful distance, understanding that her privacy had already been significantly compromised by the days. Events. Hayes remained at Sarah's shooting position as the crowd thinned, his presence reflecting both professional courtesy and genuine desire to understand how someone with her background had ended up practicing at a civilian facility in Nevada. "Can I ask what brought you to Ironclad?" he said quietly. "I made a promise," Sarah replied, her answer echoing the same response she'd given weeks earlier, but now carrying additional weight given the context of her revealed identity. "Someone who can't keep it himself anymore." The cryptic response suggested personal obligations that transcended professional recognition or civilian recreation, but Hayes understood that some promises were too personal or painful to explain to people who hadn't shared similar experiences. The fact that Sarah had chosen to honor whatever commitment had brought her to the range by revealing capabilities she'd kept hidden suggested the profound importance of whatever she was trying to accomplish. Chen returned with news that would formalize the range's recognition of what had occurred. "I've contacted the Regional Shooting Association and several military liaison offices," he reported. "They're very interested in documenting what happened here today." Sarah nodded her acceptance of whatever additional scrutiny would result from her demonstration, understanding that public revelation of her capabilities came with obligations that extended beyond personal satisfaction or vindication of her treatment. 6 months after Sarah Martinez walked away from Ironclad Tactical Range, her legend had grown beyond the confines of the Nevada desert into a story that circulated through shooting communities across the country. The tale of the quiet woman who demonstrated impossible marksmanship while being dismissed as an amateur had become a cautionary story about assumptions, respect, and the hidden excellence that walked among ordinary people unrecognized. Chen had instituted sweeping changes to range protocols within days of Sarah's demonstration, implementing policies that ensured every customer received professional assessment based on actual performance rather than superficial impressions. New staff training emphasized the importance of recognizing that military service could encompass experiences far beyond basic training, and that expertise often appeared in forms that challenged conventional expectations. Morrison had undergone the most profound personal transformation of anyone present that day. The memory of offering basic shooting advice to one of the most accomplished marksmen in military history had initially devastated his confidence, but eventually evolved into a deeper understanding of humility and professional growth. He'd requested assignment to the range's new veteran outreach program, working specifically with former military personnel who might face similar dismissal at other facilities. I learned that being an expert in something doesn't mean you can recognize expertise in others, Morrison explained to a group of new shooting instructors during a training session that had become part of Ironclad's standard orientation. Real professionals create environments where excellence can reveal itself naturally, rather than demanding proof from people who've already paid their dues. Kelly had been promoted to Customer Relations Manager. Her new role focused on ensuring that every visitor to Ironclad received the respect and attention that Sarah had been initially denied. Her experience with systematic misjudgment had transformed her into an advocate for inclusive practices that recognized excellence regardless of its packaging or presentation. The helicopter pilot, whose antenna Sarah had destroyed with surgical precision, had become an unexpected ally in spreading her legend. Captain Michael Torres, a former Army aviator working for a civilian training company, had initially been confused by his aircraft's sudden communications failure during what should have been a routine flight. When he learned that a precision shooter had deliberately targeted his antenna from an impossible distance, his reaction had evolved from anger to profound respect. "I've been shot at by professionals in combat zones," Torres told audiences at aviation safety conferences where Sarah's demonstration had become a teaching example. "But I've never encountered marksmanship like that. The precision required to disable communications without endangering the aircraft or crew represents skills that exist at the absolute pinnacle of human capability." Hayes had leveraged his military connections to document Sarah's achievements for the historical record, working with classified archives to ensure that her contributions to Special Operations success received appropriate recognition within circles that could appreciate their significance. His efforts resulted in Sarah being inducted into the Special Operations Association's Hall of Honor, a recognition ceremony she attended quietly before disappearing back into civilian anonymity. The shooting community's response to Sarah's story had rippled outward through social media, professional publications, and word-of-mouth networks that connected marksmen across geographic and institutional boundaries. The hashtag #NeverAssumeAMATUER became a rallying cry for inclusive practices in competitive shooting, while Sarah's demonstration video became required viewing at shooting schools that wanted their students to understand the difference between confidence and competence. Park had used his embarrassment as motivation for establishing a scholarship program that provided range access and instruction for veterans who might otherwise be unable to afford precision shooting training. The Sarah Martinez Memorial Fund, despite her being very much alive, honored her example by ensuring that former military personnel would never again face financial barriers to continuing their marksmanship development. Most significantly, Sarah's visit had catalyzed changes in how the broader shooting community approached assessment and inclusion. Range facilities across the country had implemented protocols based on Ironclad's new policies, creating environments where excellence could be recognized and respected, regardless of its source or presentation. The promise that had brought Sarah to Ironclad had indeed been fulfilled, though its nature remained private information that she shared only with Hayes during their final conversation. The helicopter antenna shot had been dedicated to a fallen teammate whose son was graduating from sniper school, a demonstration that the skills he'd inherited were in good hands and would be honored by those who understood their significance. 3 years later, Jessica Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, walked into a shooting facility in Colorado with the same quiet confidence that had characterized Sarah's approach to Ironclad. As a former military police officer transitioning to civilian life, Jessica faced many of the same assumptions and dismissals that had greeted Sarah in Nevada. But this time, the range staff had been trained in recognition protocols that emphasized assessment over assumption. Jessica's military service was acknowledged with appropriate respect. Her shooting capabilities were evaluated fairly, and her progression through the facility's systems was based on demonstrated performance rather than superficial impressions. We've all heard the story about the woman who shot down the helicopter, the range master explained to Jessica during her orientation. It taught us that real professionals don't need to prove themselves to people who wouldn't recognize excellence if it walked through the front door carrying a rifle. Sarah Martinez had returned to her quiet civilian life, her legend growing even as her personal presence faded from public attention. She'd achieved something remarkable, transforming an entire community's understanding of respect, recognition, and the hidden excellence that existed in unexpected forms throughout society. The story of her demonstration continued to inspire former military personnel who faced dismissal and discrimination in civilian environments, while serving as a perpetual reminder that assumptions about capability were often inversely related to actual competence. Her legacy lived on in policies, protocols, and attitudes that ensured future generations of veterans would receive the recognition they'd earned through service that often remained invisible to those who benefited from it. In the end, Sarah had accomplished more than vindication or recognition. She'd created lasting change that honored both her fallen teammates and the countless veterans who deserved respect for achievements that existed beyond civilian understanding, ensuring that excellence would be recognized wherever it appeared, regardless of how quietly it chose to present itself. 5 years later, a young woman named Emma Rodriguez walked into Ironclad Tactical Range, carrying a faded photograph and a letter written in careful handwriting. The photograph showed 2 soldiers on a mountainside in Afghanistan, a female sniper and a male spotter, both squinting against the desert sun. Chen recognized the woman in the photo immediately. Sarah Martinez, though the name on the letter was different, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos. "She saved my father's life," Emma explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He was the spotter in that photo. Before he died last month, he made me promise to find the woman who brought him home from 3 impossible missions. He said her real name was Sarah, but she used Maria as her cover identity." Emma handed Chen the letter. In Sarah's distinctive handwriting were coordinates to a remote location in Montana and a simple message: "Tell her the promise goes both ways. Some of us made it home because of her." Chen smiled, understanding finally why Sarah had chosen his range for her demonstration. It wasn't about vindication or recognition. It was about honoring fallen friends and keeping faith with the living. The helicopter shot hadn't been a display of skill. It had been a memorial service disguised as marksmanship. "I'll make sure she gets this," Chen promised, knowing that legends sometimes needed to remain legends, quietly serving others even after their wars had ended. The story of Sarah Martinez reminds us that extraordinary people walk among us every day, carrying achievements we'll never fully understand. Heroes don't always wear uniforms or seek recognition sometimes. They just ask politely for range time. What stories of hidden excellence have you encountered in your own life? Share them in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of everyday heroes who prove that assumptions can be more dangerous than any enemy. Hit that notification bell. You never know when the next legend might reveal themselves.